Ladies and gentlemen, welcome into another, actually it's the first series of lectures that we'll be doing this year, called a series of historical rants with Coach Krieger. I am Coach Krieger, and I'm going to be teaching you guys a little history this year. Kind of right off the bat, I want to say one, welcome in, taking some time to go through these videos. At the same time, let's try to learn something again with each other this year. What I'm going to be discussing today, right off the bat, kind of disclaimer, is not necessarily fun to talk about. It's not a topic in which you get to learn a historical event and it's whimsical in nature, or you get to hear about a duel or a fist fight or something like that. We'll be talking about some serious topics today. We're going to be talking about the period post-Civil War. So for those of you that had U.S. History 1, most U.S. History 1 classes leave off right around the period right after the Civil War, with the freeing of the slaves, Abraham Lincoln, the Emancipation Proclamation, and that's where we will begin this course, is the period of American history that's often, sometimes overlooked, called Reconstruction. So if you're going to reconstruct something, let's break this down. If you're going to reconstruct something, what does that mean? Does it mean to rebuild and to reshape? And that's exactly what America had to do after the Civil War, is to rebuild and reshape society to reflect a more egalitarian or equal image that it had set forth in the Declaration of Independence and some of the documents of its founding. So much of the American South, as you know, if you learn from U.S. History 1, is a farming society. And many of these slaves played a central role in the American South being the largest producer of cotton on the entire planet, and other goods as well. So the image that the South will have to go through during Reconstruction is, what do you do with these 4 million newly freed people? How will they start to blend into society? How are we going to help them blend into society? And much of what happens during Reconstruction, there are some positives. Obviously, the 13th Amendment will free slaves, and the 14th Amendment, one of the most important in our Constitution, will give equal access, equal citizenship rights to African Americans. But at the same time, there's this violent backlash that takes place. It's supposed to be a period of peace. You think after war is going to be a period of peace. But that's not always the case, as we will see in this particular video. So first things first, we will discuss, I like to start with this particular quote. It comes from the black intellectual, one of the most famous black intellectuals of the time, a gentleman by the name of W.E.B. Du Bois. And in his book, Black Reconstruction America, Du Bois kind of lays out what he feels was some of the problems with Reconstruction. So I'm going to read that to you now. This quote, it says, quote, "One reads the truer, deeper facts of Reconstruction with a great despair. It is at once so simple and human, and yet so futile. There's no villain, no idiot, no saint. They're just men who crave ease and power. The planters, having lost the war for slavery, sought to begin again where they left off in the 1860s, mere substituting for individual ownership of slaves, a new state of serfdom for black folks." So essentially, Du Bois will argue in his book that what happened after the Civil War was not this reshaping of society. It was a rebranding of slavery by a new name. So oftentimes, kids will ask me, why do I need to know this? Why is these long ago historical things? Why are we discussing this? Why does it matter? And oftentimes, if you pay attention to what's happening in our country today, it's easy to reflect and say that it is in a bubble and that it doesn't have any type of background or meaning. But many of the things that we're going to discuss, if you've been paying paying attention to the news, even recently since the COVID-19 pandemic started, there has also been a growing sentiment in our country and a correlation to understand the movements of today, the protesting that has taken place, particularly the Black Lives Matter movement. So I often say that you've heard the statement to understand today you must look to the past, and oftentimes when we look at our current state in American society today, as you look at some of these photographs, you see these widespread protests. You see the Black Lives Matter movement start to gain steam. But that's not in a bubble. It's not something that started in 2020, and much of the discontent that has been felt by the Black Lives Matter movement in the community can be traced back to the 1960s and the Civil Rights Movement. It can be traced back to 2015. Starting with the Michael Brown protest in Ferguson, Missouri. And then it can be traced all the way back as far as this Reconstruction period, where you're going to see, as you'll see in this series of videos, voter suppression. You'll see racial violence, and all those things are not easy to talk about, but they're part of American history and they're part of American society, and it's something we need to come to reckon with if we want to understand our current. Okay, so with that being said, if we're going to look to the past as an analogy for the future here and to see where we're at with our current political climate, it would be really helpful to know kind of to trace the lineage back, and you could go all the way as far back as 1619 when the first slave ships arrived on the American continent. But for our studies, we'll start with the Dred Scott decision in 1857, a famous Supreme Court case in which famously Chief Justice Roger B. Taney was stated as saying that, quote, blacks have no rights which a white man is bound to respect, essentially saying the black man's rights are not the same as white men in America. And the Civil War, of course, will change that in some instances. So I'm going to play a little bit of this video here from NBC News that kind of looks at a very short history of the current kind of political climate, the Black Lives Matter movement, and kind of how it gained national attention.
When 17-year-old Trayvon Martin died at the hands of George Zimmerman in 2012, protests sprung up around the country, demanding everything from changes to Florida's stand-your-ground laws to gun control.
When do our children get to just be children?
But one of the protests,
Black Lives Matter,
quickly took on a life of its own. The phrase Black Lives Matter was first coined in 2013 by 3 African-American women in response to George Zimmerman's acquittal. But the term didn't gain widespread use until August 9, 2014, when Michael Brown was shot and killed by a white police officer in Ferguson, Missouri. Protesters swarmed the city, holding signs that read, Black Lives Matter. The overwhelming police response to the protests kept the slogan in the news for days. While Ferguson began to calm down, the combination of social media, ubiquitous video cameras, and the recurrence of African-American deaths at the hands of police meant that it was only a matter of time before Black Lives Matter reappeared.
On behalf of all New Yorkers, I want to offer my deepest condolences to the family and loved ones of Eric Garner.
4 months later, when a police officer was acquitted in the death of Eric Garner, an unarmed African-American man in Staten Island who was choked to death on camera, Black Lives Matter was everywhere.
Justice for Eric Garner! Justice for Eric Garner!
In the days after Garner's death, rallies were held in 5 cities, with protesters calling themselves part of the Black Lives Matter movement.
I can't breathe!
Almost a year later in Baltimore, Freddie Gray, a 25-year-old African-American man, was chased by police and later found in the back of a police van with 80% of his spine severed. Riots ensued and the damage cost an estimated $9 million.
Stand stand up and say loudly and clearly, Black Lives Matter.
And activists from Black Lives Matter affiliates have since confronted politicians at campaign events.
We're gonna let you on the mic. We're gonna give you the mic.
Black Lives Matter! Black Lives Matter!
The online movement has taken on a life of its own. And unlike a lot of hashtag activism, the Black Lives Matter banner has generated a sustained rallying cry for change and real-world results. When the University of Missouri came under fire for failing to address persistent complaints about racism on campus, Black Lives Matter contributed to protests that toppled the school's president.
Nobody is free until all of us are free. That's the end goal.
The movement has generated some backlash, but the core argument that African Americans aren't treated equally is backed up by statistics that show that black men are killed by police at a higher rate than white men. Until those numbers change, the Black Lives Matter movement isn't likely to go away anytime soon.
So with this particular movement as our current political backdrop, I think it's helpful to understand that history is only useful in context. So looking at that, we've got to say, where are we at, where have we been, and where are we going? Those three questions kind of guide our historical understanding, especially on a topic as diverse and complex as this. So the study of history, more than anything, is meant to educate us about the mistakes of the past. And through understanding those mistakes, hopefully we can gain some sort of perspective into our current day situation that we have. Otherwise, why are we even doing this? Why would we study history in the first place? I believe that there are tipping point moments in history, some more prominent than others, that make us re-examine whether or not we have done a good job in teaching certain concepts and aspects to the whole general population. And one of those particular tipping point moments, I believe, when it comes to educating the public on something like Reconstruction, I believe happened in 2015. On June 17th, 2015, a shooter walked into the Emmanuel African Methodist Church in Charleston, South Carolina. This is one of the many historical black churches in Charleston, South Carolina. Charleston being known as the Holy City because it's one of the cities in the United States that has a large per capita number of churches in the city. Just walk around, they're everywhere. This shooter, who will go unnamed, prayed with the congregation there, even sat for, I believe it was upwards of 30 or 45 minutes in a Bible study before pulling his weapon and killing 9 churchgoers. The hate and vitriol that would later emerge from this is shocking to the national senses. You wouldn't think that in 2015 something like this could still exist, but the shooter told churchgoers he had to do this. You're taking over our country and you have to go. With that context, that happened in 2015, the Emmanuel Church shooting in Charleston. When we look through Reconstruction, as you'll see, some of these incidents are similar incidents that happened even in the 1870s. So where are we at? Where have we been and where are we going? How do we fix these types of problems? How do you fix these type of race relations issues that sometimes seem very deeply embedded in the American culture? So oftentimes I think it's important to shed light using quotes from the time period. And one historian that I used in my thesis said this about Reconstruction. I think it may summarize this era in a succinct way. He said, "Nothing renders society more restless than a revolution half accomplished." And in many ways, that's what Reconstruction was. It was a revolution that was half accomplished. The work that was set forth in the Emancipation Proclamation and 14th Amendment did not go into effect, at least until really a century later when you have the Civil Rights Movement, will these issues be brought up again. So the Civil War did not solve this issue of slavery and equality and egalitarian ideals of people being able to have free and equal opportunities within the United States. And those problems still exist to an extent today. But the revolution, or the work of the revolution, as we can see from the 2015 shooting at the Emmanuel African Methodist Church, continues. And there was a poignant moment, and I won't play the clip for you, I will show you a photo here. At the funeral of these 9 shooting victims, you always try to have hope for the future. And the president at that time was President Barack Obama, and he attended the funeral and actually sang Amazing Grace. Broke out in song in Amazing Grace at the funeral. So despite this bleak period, even in American history, there is hope. There is hope that things will get better, and that's something to hold on to for sure.